Welcome to Talking China Business, a crayfish.io podcast on how to grow your business and succeed in the Chinese market. We delve into the practical issues, obstacles, solutions, and case studies about driving business growth in China. Here is your host, Ting Zhang, founder and CEO at crayfish.io.
Hello, welcome to our podcast, Talking China Business. Since our podcast in January, we have seen the UK, China both making diplomatic efforts. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry Wang Yi has visited the UK to meet with UK Foreign Secretary David Lammy. And then also the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer is going to visit China later, and this has been planned. We also have heard that the new Chinese embassy in London has received conditional support. So this is all seem to be positive developments here. So today we would be looking at why an enduring and strong UK-China relationship, which is in Keir Starmer's words, matters to business, education, and people in both countries. For today's podcast, I have the great pleasure to have Professor Kerry Brown to be my guest. And Kerry is Professor of Chinese Studies and Director of the Lau China Institute at King's College London, who I have had the privilege to know since mid-2000s. So welcome to Kerry.
Thank you very much. Good to speak to you again, Ting.
Right. So, Kerry, you have held various affiliate roles, and including Chatham House London, Australia-New Zealand School of Government in Melbourne, and German Institute for Global Affairs in Hamburg, and also the Mongolia and Inner Asian Studies Unit at Cambridge. So you're a truly international leading China scholar. So how has all this started for you?
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's great to speak to you today. You're right. We've known each other since the 2000s. I think the China Advisory Network, remember, we used to sit, I think about 20 of us, and how things have changed since then. So, I mean, my engagement with China was really accidental. I was a Foreign Office official in the late 1990s, early 2000s. I had lived in China before in Inner Mongolia, in Huaihao, and then I kind of gravitated towards academic work. I did do my PhD when I was a diplomat, actually, but at the University of Leeds. And so, you know, kind of it's more by accident than design become part of my life. And I kind of can't say, although, you know, I work as an academic, as you know, there's so many aspects of China and its impact on the world now. No one can really say that they're an expert on anything, really. I mean, you'd have to spend your whole life looking at, you know, very specific things. And even then, you kind of can't really say that you're a complete expert. I've looked at the number of books published on China every year. I mean, it's huge. I'm surrounded by these books, and this is a small proportion. Every year there's a huge number. And so it's really impossible to keep on top of all of this. But it's important that we try, and people like you and I, we try and make sense of this complicated relationship. And sometimes we help, and sometimes we're as confused as everyone else.
Yeah, I know we are all trying our best from different angles. I guess you are more from the academia, research, but while I'm more from the business side. As you know, Crayfish helps Western business, mainly British, but also European companies to succeed in China. So we work a lot with the UK SMEs, but some of them are also large listed companies as well. So we're interested to talk about those in the podcast. So talking about books, which I can see you're surrounded by all the China books, but you are the author of almost 20 books on modern Chinese politics, and you've written those for every single major international news outlets and be interviewed by every major news channel on issues relating to contemporary China. Your new book, which I really enjoyed reading over Christmas, The Great Rehearsal, Britain, China, and the 400 Years Contest for Power. So for those who haven't read it, Could you explain why it's relevant to today's readers, to today's UK-China relation?
Yeah, I mean, The Great Reversal was written, I had a year sabbatical in 2023, 2024. And I thought, what would be a useful thing to do? I had originally thought of writing a history of European relations with China, but actually that's huge. That would have taken 10 years, not one. And then I thought, well, I've been, as a British person, been dealing with China for so long, since 1991, basically. And yet, my knowledge of Britain's relations with China, its history, is, there's bits that I know quite a lot about, particularly the last 100 years. Everyone knows about the Opium Wars, the Anglo-Chinese Wars in the 19th century, and about the Macartney mission in the late 18th century when they met the Qianlong Emperor. We know bits and pieces, but I realized that there wasn't a book that had it all down in one place. There's amazing scholarship about specific parts of this, huge archives in Britain, the Jardine archives that are at Cambridge University Library, the Foreign Office archives, which are online and in Kew, Swire archives, which are in SOAS. We have a huge amount of information about what Britain and China have done. So I thought I will try and write a comprehensive history so that people can at least know where we've come from with this relationship. And I wrote that. It starts in, as you say, 400 years ago, 430 years ago, when Elizabeth I wrote several letters to the Wanli Emperor in the Ming Dynasty. None of them got to Beijing. And if they got there, as you well know, Wanli was retired. He didn't have any interest in day-to-day activity. He basically got fed up with his officials and kind of retreated into the Forbidden Palace. So no one would probably have told him about these letters. In any case, the East India Company was set up at the very last day of the 1599, and that did business with China for 200 plus years. So most of the relationship for the first 230 years was business. It was always about business, and particularly about tea. As you know, tea imported from China first appeared, I think, in 1650s, became very popular, became huge as a national drink, and British people paid enormous amounts of money for it. To balance the trade, Britain then sold opium unofficially into China, and of course that's an enormously controversial issue even till today, and then created these wars in the 19th century. So I give an account of those. And then in the 20th century, a sort of retreat of Britain's imperial interests in China, which were huge. I mean, at the end of the 19th century, Britain had massive interests in China, which were slowly reduced. Other players came to the fore, the Russians, Germans, Japanese, very tragically with the war from 1937. And then, of course, the creation of New China in 1949. That's the era we live in today. But I think there's two things about that history in writing it. It really taught me. One is, no matter what, Britain and China since the beginning have had a relationship, and we never stopped talking to each other. And most of that relationship, to come to the second thing, has been collaborative. I mean, we often think Britain and China have had a very difficult relationship, and it's true, there's been some big clashes. But in fact, most of the time, it's been British and Chinese collaborating. And this conversation today represents that. Here I am, British. You obviously originally from China, but now living here. We are both, like many other partnerships in Britain, working together. I'm always learning from Chinese colleagues or colleagues originally from China, now living here. We couldn't do anything really without that. And I think that's been the pattern for the last 400 years, that the Chinese have been the main teachers about their country and their culture. And without that, British people wouldn't have understood a great deal, and British people have tried to teach Chinese about Britain. It's been always a very collaborative relationship, which I think we need to remember, particularly today when things are not so easy. But we'll talk about that a little bit later, I believe.
Yes, I think the book was really helpful for me. As you say, it's having all the history in one place. Because, of course, I grew up in China. I was educated in China, so I learned some of the history from the Chinese history book. Of course, UK was not featured main part of it. So, I never learned the first UK-China interaction. So that was very helpful, but also it was a very systematic understanding and learning. So there's various efforts from the British side to actually start the trade with China. And that, of course, we all know the McCartney's mission, but from the before and what happened after, it's not very well known to many people. So I find it really helpful to read that. And I learned a lot for that. So I highly recommend that, not just to the British people who are either, business or student, but also to Chinese people who particularly have an interest in the UK or live in the UK or doing business or studying. It's really helped put things into the historic perspective. So we talk about the, historically, there's a lot of challenges for the UK and China, which you have outlined very well in the book up till recent years. But if we look at current challenges facing these two countries from the government level, but also the education and business side, I think we have so many challenges. I guess we will start with the education, which is what, you are now focusing on. So how important is China to the UK education industry, and what are the main challenges you see?
For sure, education cooperation between China and Britain has been massive. In the last 20 years, there's been so many Chinese students come to Britain. So on that level, even today, there's something like 180,000 Chinese students at British universities. And a fall in their number has a big impact on British universities' finance and budgets. In the news in 2025, when we're speaking, Cardiff University, Edinburgh University, Durham University are all making job cuts because their international student numbers are falling. At King's College London, we're maintaining them, but it's extremely challenging. So Chinese students have contributed a huge amount to British education just through funding. And I think they should be given a way higher status than they're given. I think that's really important. We've grown lazy and complacent about how Chinese students come to Britain. But I suppose the second thing I'll say is that Chinese education now, as you well know, it's an area you probably look at, is very competitive. Chinese universities are rising in the global rankings. Beida, Tsinghua, Fudan University, all very highly ranked in QS and other rankings, going up and up and up. If you look at research and development spending in China, I think the National Bureau of Statistics had it last year as something like $400 billion US. For Britain, our budget last year was about $20 billion US. I mean, it's just a big joke to say that China is now, China used to say that China was an imitator and, not an innovator. Anyone that says that now is talking nonsense. DeepSeek and all these other things have shown that China is definitely an innovator. So I think the story of our engagement with China is changing. We now need to work with China because they have really advanced things in AI, robotics, life sciences that no one ever kind of thought this would happen so quickly. You think Nature Journal, most of the peer-reviewed articles in that now are by Chinese colleagues. So I think one of the challenges is British policymakers understanding that this is a massive shift, that we all sort of thought that we were the innovators, we created the technology, and now that's not the case. China is definitely a major knowledge partner. I suppose the final thing I say about Chinese studies in Britain is that it's getting, really critical. In China, it's not unusual to find, most people at universities will speak probably English, at least one foreign language, but most speak English. And the amount of collaboration with international partners is usually kind of pretty high. The knowledge of the outside world amongst people, educated people in China, is good. Usually it's pretty good. Whereas in Britain, our knowledge of Asia and China is poor. the number of graduates in Chinese studies in Britain is falling. It was, I looked at the British Association of Chinese Studies statistics for 2023. I mean, it was about 300 graduates a year. It's now down to about 250 graduates a year. Cambridge University, where, the city where you're based, my old university when I was an undergraduate, very long-standing Chinese degree course. And apparently this year their numbers were falling. They couldn't recruit the number they normally recruited. I find in the institute that I direct, the Lau China Institute, most of the students we have are still international, most are Chinese. There are a number from Britain and Europe, but not huge. And yet I would have thought that that's our key group. We have to educate Europeans and British, particularly about China, but the depth is just not there. So we need to really look at how we, I guess there's two big things. One is we have to take China super seriously as a major player now and devote effort and time to it, the way we do with America, the way we do with Europe. And I think secondly, we need to basically have much broader education about China in Britain, in language, in culture. I think it's, made very political sometimes. If you teach about China, you get criticized because they say that you're, all this nonsense about, Confucius Institutes, that they're, really propagandists for the Chinese state. I think that's just ridiculous because if we don't speak any Chinese language, if we don't have any cultural understanding, well, then we're just ignorant. We're not brainwashed. We're ignorant. I mean, that seems to me worse in some ways. In any case, I don't think that Confucius Institutes particularly try and brainwash people. I think people can work out when they hear propaganda or not. I think we just need to be way better educated about issues around China.
I totally agree with you. And I find that the European countries and the Americans, they have much more Chinese speaking capability and resources. They are more open to Chinese culture too. I was in Belgium last week for Chinese New Year reception. We are a member of the Flanders China Chamber of Commerce. We've got some clients in Belgium. So when I went there, I was quite surprised that all the people I met at the reception, they were Europeans, well, from Flanders, Belgian business too. They all use WeChat. Some of them speak Chinese, and some of them told me they're learning Chinese. But I guess it doesn't help that in the UK, the general perception among the public to China is more negative, I guess. I remember in your book, you mentioned that China ranks 111th in the YouGov poll in early 2024. And that's nearly the bottom of the list, I think. This is actually terrible, thinking about that in China, most people actually have a positive view of the UK country and the UK people, of course. So do you think this is changing, or would this likely to change in a new Labour government?
I think that British people historically, as the book, The Great Reversal sort of shows, have been a bit ambiguous, a bit sort of in two minds about China. I think on the one hand, that they do appreciate Chinese culture, chinoiserie and Chinese design, and Chinese New Year is very popular in London and elsewhere, as you know.
And the food.
And the food, yeah, extremely popular. But on the other hand, I think that they don't really like Chinese politics, and they don't like, and that's probably true with Australia and America too. I mean, it's very divided.
Yeah.
So I don't think British people have really got a set view of China. I think that that poll from 2024 that you refer to had been impacted by the beg pardon. That poll that you referred to had been impacted by the pandemic.
Yes.
And I think the pandemic had quite a negative impact because people blame China and they got this very negative view of how China had, reacted to the pandemic. And so I think that was very specific. And now I think that is retreating a bit. It isn't so bad today under the new Labour government. Relations with China, as you said earlier, it's more pragmatic. I don't think that we are so obsessed by particular issues. I mean, I think that Britain remains very focused on Hong Kong, and it's an important issue, but it's not the whole of our relationship with China. And I think that obviously there are many people originally from Hong Kong in Britain. They have very strong opinions about China. I understand that. But again, that's not the whole story, right? We have a very broad relationship. And the whole point of politics and diplomacy is trying to balance things. And I mean, there are massive parts of our relationship with China which are nothing to do with Hong Kong. And we just have to kind of find a way of trying to balance all of these. I think that Britain is, kind of at the moment, I think that as you say, our views of China might be negative, but I don't think they're that deep. I mean, there are very few people in Britain who bother to know much about what we do with China. I mean, you deal with these people, and I deal with them all the time. There's quite a small group of people. We all know each other, right? And I think it's quite funny that this huge relationship, and yet there's not a big group of people that really invest in it, in terms of time and effort. And I think that actually, kind of most people just don't really think about China a great deal until they have to. And then they might think, for instance, some things are useful, some things are not useful. Now, what's interesting now is, as the geopolitics is just so crazy. We have an America under Trump that's attacking its allies, an America under Trump which is sort of looking like doing very big bilateral deals. And I think for Britain, it's going to have an impact because once we just thought America would always be our big ally. And now we're really wondering, right? I mean, what will this country do? It's not so certain. So I think that we're going to be more likely to think of China in a context where there's some things where we'll definitely have to be allies. I'll give you an example on climate change. Under Biden, the US was very supportive. Under Trump, they just don't think it's a problem. Well, China is still really an important partner. You get a lot of the anti-China brigade going on about, well, China doesn't take climate change seriously. These are people who've never been to the country, don't really understand what China's doing. They haven't got a clue. So you can just discount them. They're just sort of, propagating ignorance. But it does matter, it matters to Xi Jinping and his government. The people in China, the middle class, want clean water, want clean environment. The smogs, remember, about 12 years ago, when I went to Beijing and was staying in the Jiali Zhongxin, the Kerry Center, I couldn't see opposite, right? You remember that time when planes landed, you could barely see anything. Well, that's all ended now. It has cleaned up the environment. On that thing, Britain and China, I think, could do a lot. And actually, China's technology will probably be very useful. So I don't know if America's going to engage. Probably at a state level, it will. But certainly at a country-to-country level, I reckon Britain and China can probably do more bilaterally in these areas. And with America, it's more difficult. This is a very strange situation we're in, but I think that will change our dynamics with China. I think China's going to become more important to us as, our more traditional partners just aren't very predictable and aren't very reliable.
Yeah, it's very interesting you say that now. UK is thinking what we're going to do when US is now taking such a drastic turn of how it works with its allies. And I think if you look historically, UK-China relationship wasn't affected by another country, right? So it wasn't following, for example, its ally, US. It was deciding what it wants to do with China. And maybe that's what you're saying now. UK actually comes back to think what we want to do with China, how we're going to make this relationship work without thinking too much about what's implication with the relationship between UK and US, because that should be a separate matter, because that would help, I think, the UK make a better decision, independent decision on how to deal with China, because when we have our clients, some of our clients have to make that difficult choice to say, do I prioritize US or do I prioritize China? Sometimes they can't do both. One of our clients was was fundraising, and then they got big amount committed from US. We were talking to them about Chinese investor. Then they said, "Oh, sorry, we can't now do that because our US investor was adamant that they are not going to want a Chinese investor on board." So this made, for the UK companies actually losing out because they could have benefited from both US and China as markets, but also as investor destination as well. So also I want to touch on what you said earlier on innovation and China has progress. I mean, has now done so much more in science and innovation. In fact, it's now a major innovator and also a global powerhouse for the future, for the research, right? As you mentioned, all the citations and co-author work for academic papers. But recently, as we've seen from DeepSeek, China is actually leading, I think, the world in how innovation can be done, in cost effectively, and under the America ban on semiconductor and also access to AI hasn't helped. And that's what I was saying even 2 years ago when I did an interview with Herman Hauser, who's known as the tech father for UK industry. He was saying that US is basically making China to develop its own semiconductor, and that's happening, and then we can see that. So, so I think for the UK, economy is a lot more smaller, so it cannot be comparing with US or even Europe. So for UK's own position is how to leverage the UK's capability innovation, but also embrace China as a partner for commercialization, because we actually work a lot with some startups who have very exciting technology, but they don't have the funding or the market to bring it to market quickly. And by working with Chinese, VCs or Chinese partners, they can make that happen much more quickly, scale up much more quickly. We have seen this in number of clients. One of the things you mentioned in terms of the Chinese studies, I heard that when I had lunch on Sunday with the vice president of a Chinese university, he said that the new PhD applications in STEM subject areas who are funded by the Chinese National Scholarship Fund are now being rejected. Have you known that? What's your view on that?
You mean in Britain, does China Scholarship Council, those sorts of things?
No, the Chinese National Scholarship Fund found a lot of Chinese students to come study, not necessarily all in STEM subjects, but apparently in some areas they are being rejected.
From British universities?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't heard that, but I mean, the scheme I know about, which might have an overlap, is the China Scholarship, the China Scholarships, there were, for instance, King's has an allocation of 100, and we certainly don't use that many each year. And I don't know what number go into STEM subjects. I'm not sure. I mean, the broader question though about all of this cooperation is what does Britain want, right? I mean, what do we want? At the moment, as you know, when you're based in Britain, I'm based in Britain, our economy is barely growing. Right, our productivity is no good. We can't decide on infrastructure. It takes forever. China's built 40,000 kilometers of high-speed train in the last, 15 years. We built none. I mean, you've been to Beijing, Daxing Airport, massive airport opened in 2019. I mean, we still are arguing about a new runway, not a new airport, a new runway at Heathrow. So we have to ask ourselves, what do we want? We want, it's okay if we feel that China is not a partner that we agree with. We can say we'll not deal with China, right? But that means that we won't deal with the world's second biggest economy. We won't get access to the Chinese middle class for our products and services. Well, we'll have to have an alternative. But Britain doesn't have easy relations with Europe now because of Brexit. We don't have easy relations with America because it's very unpredictable. India, not an easy partner, as you well know. I mean, it's very hard to do business in India, very bureaucratic, very kind of, protectionist in some ways. I don't know. I mean, if your focus is on prosperity and on growing your economy, you have to deal with the big players, and that includes China. You have to have an agenda. For us, for Britain, I mean, what is important is the prosperity of British people. I mean, that's what we can learn from the Chinese government. It's the only thing that it's really said since 1978, with the reform and opening up. Prosperity. That's the agenda, making people more prosperous. And it's achieved that. And we can argue about how it's done it. We can argue about what it should do now. But certainly people absolutely in China are wealthier, healthier, and better off than they were 40 years ago, right? In Britain, well, we're a little bit better off than we were, maybe, but I don't think that we've really advanced a great deal. And if we really want to make British people more prosperous, which means that we'll then be more secure, and it means that we'll be more able to deal with our problems and our health service, then we definitely have to have a plan for how to deal with a significant economy like China, which is 18% of global GDP. At the moment, as you well know, the stock of Chinese investment in Britain is 0.2%. 0.2%. That hasn't increased a great deal for 10 years. As you well know, I mean, China is our fourth or fifth biggest trading partner, but it's still quite a big deficit in China's favor. We can do better. Access to Chinese services is also something we could do better. The City of London is still an important place for renminbi, and banks. We can definitely do better. I mean, I think this is not a relationship that we have got as much as we can out of for Britain's prosperity. So if you're going to ask me today what a strategy would be, I think the only thing is we don't need to kind of think a great deal about all these complicated issues about, kind of how do we align our values. We've thought about that. We're never going to agree. Our priority has to be prosperity for Britain. We do not feel prosperous today. British people do not feel prosperous. And I feel like if we don't get relationships that make us feel more prosperous, everything else is not so important. I'm not interested in people preaching about how we should, kind of be promoting British values. We have had massive challenges ourselves in trying to unify, politics in Britain. It's not easy. It's not, something that we can start telling others we should, how they should behave. What we should do is focus on our prosperity before we start telling others how they should behave. And that, I think, should be just the one thing we think about. For the Labour government, they have to think about our relationships and how they help us with prosperity and how China helps us with prosperity. So I think at the moment they're kind of doing the right thing, but we have to have results from it. That's the most important thing.
Mm. Yes, I think when you talk about prosperity is people, but also business.
Yeah.
So we have recently been doing some survey with those companies we work with, and in our network, we actually found that more companies are positive about doing business in China because it helps their business. It helps them to increase their employment here. And that is in turn contributing to prosperity of the country, of the people. Also, I talk about European attitude or Europeans' way of doing business with China. I do think they are more open and to work with China. I was in Oslo about 3 weeks ago, and when I visited one of the city council building, actually on the main entrance there was in English and the Norwegian language and in Chinese to say how do you get into the building for meetings. I was actually really surprised. Imagine we have that in Cambridge on the city council door or in London.
That would be...
Yeah, and of course in Helsinki airport or many European, even Italian airport, you have Chinese language signs everywhere. I think now maybe in the UK they're adding a little bit. I don't see enough, or I haven't seen much. But this has been like in Finland for years. I'm just using that as a symbol, right? It's a symbol of how the country take China or Chinese visitors seriously.
Yes.
Yeah. And of course, I left China 28 years ago. So
Mm.
as you see, in China, people's prosperity has hugely increased. So all the people I know in China are doing really well,
Mm.
financially, family. And here in the UK, we haven't changed that much. As you say, we just done a little bit better. But compared to China, it was really a quantum leap.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
UK can really benefit working with China to, to capitalize on some of those wealth it created. And the reason I talked about earlier, the PhD student, is because I think by UK university turning away those bright Chinese PhD application when they are funded by the Chinese National Scholarship Fund, the result is we are actually, the UK are not getting enough more new talent into the research and innovation, right? Because I can see that two things. One is academic output, of course, but another one is also in a UK startup economy, because I have met many Chinese founders, co-founders, some very exciting tech, from VR to clean tech, from photonics to gun materials and device. So now I think if the UK university are turning those Chinese students, talented PhD students away, if that's the case, then I of course, the Chinese university are very happy to keep these bright scholars home, but that's UK's loss for the future talented workforce as well, right?
No, I completely agree. It's true in America too. As you said earlier, number of Chinese who don't stay in America go back to China is China's gain, right? I mean, that human capital is very precious. I was really struck when I was in China last August and September. I mean, because of the pandemic, there'd been a long gap. I mean, usually I'd been going very, very frequently. And then in 2020, because of the pandemic, just didn't go. And even in that sort of 4.5 years gap, going back, you could see lots of changes. But one of the ones that I did really notice, well, two. One was there aren't many foreigners going to China at the moment. Very few Americans. I think there were something like 8,000. I think it was 8,000 American students in China in 2019. And now that's about 800.
Wow.
So a big fall. I think for the British, it's also a pretty significant fall. But also business visitors, not many business visitors, very few. And I think the second thing is that technology in China now is ever present, right? I mean, EVs, robots in hotels serving you. I mean, high-speed trains, they say, it was always, yeah, we were very familiar with that, but it's just the norm, right? It's the norm to sort of go on a high-speed train wherever you want to go, right? I mean, it's sort of the norm. And I guess I think the problem is we have a knowledge in Britain, most people, because they just haven't been to China for a while, which is already 5 years out of date. And 5 years in China is like 20 years elsewhere, right? I mean, so I think that we do need to get policymakers and people there to just sort of basically see, as you say, how many talented young people have gone back to China. At universities, I went to the Chinese University, Hong Kong in Shenzhen. Many of their staff are returnees from either Europe or China, from America. I mean, really senior scholars have gone back. And so, kind of this is a real brain drain in reverse. I don't know I mean, one thing we have to do is to get people there as much as possible. It's important to go. I think China is keen for people to go now. Now there's this visa-free access for most Europeans, not for British at the moment, but, hopefully that will happen. I think that when you do go there also, you're given quite a warm welcome. I think people are really keen to see you go. I think people obviously sometimes are apprehensive. They hear sort of some negative stories, but my experience last time was good. I think it was good. I think the only other final thing is that, officially now under the new government, there's more official contact. As you say, Starmer, the Prime Minister, might go to China this year. That's really important. It would be great to have a senior Chinese. I mean, 1 year's just been, but maybe Li Chang, the Premier, to come to Britain. I think it's been 10 years since the state visit. Li Keqiang, the former Premier, did come, I think, in 2014. I'm not sure if he came afterwards, but we do need that to happen to at least show, right, this relationship is now kind of normal. It's no longer a big sort of issue. And just finally, I mean, we talk about the security legislation in China and how things are securitized, but we've also become highly securitized. I mean, the national security law for Britain, I think in 2022, I mean, it's very broad. It's kind of, this sort of thing has created a chilling effect on people researching with Chinese partners. I think there needs to be more clarity. Of course, there are some sensitive areas that, yeah, completely understand that. But a lot of areas, China is now China is ahead, right? I mean, this idea of China being always coming and pinching intellectual property. I mean, whatever the truth in the past, it's now the other way round. It's us that need to pinch China's intellectual property. I mean, it's kind of incredible what they're doing and the way they're doing things. And I think we need to be educated about that. We shouldn't be complacent.
Yeah, definitely. I think in areas, for example, in 5G, China is leading. So how can, China is copying from others? It's already leading. But also, we see that now there's a more actually business in the UK. I think probably with this new Labour government are feeling a little bit more excited again about China. Our recent survey actually has shown that while China is still seen as difficult because of the, strong compliance requirement and also regulatory hurdles. And of course, there's cultural barriers always there and perception of IP issue. Most of the people still think that China offers immense potential because it has a massive consumer base and also there's so many more sectors that companies can consider as well. So particularly, we are actually now working with a listed company to open a new manufacturing assembly in China, which is very exciting for them because they can tap into new market segment that they couldn't. But also, it's really good, of course, for the local Chinese district or the city they're going to choose to set up because China has been seeing a lot of foreign investment withdraw in the last couple of years. Many reasons, right? Geopolitics is one, but also some companies are truly finding them hard to compete now because the Chinese companies have come up with better products, cheaper products, and that is unfortunately the commercial reality. But in this particular case with this company, they already selling to China, selling very well, have a good market share. But there's different segment of market that can only be satisfied if they can bring the cost for that particular model much lower to meet the Chinese domestic competition. So they are setting up manufacturing there. Of course, the Chinese local governments are now desperate. I mean, they're all welcoming foreign investment. So I think that at very micro level, if we can see more companies benefiting from China's manufacturing excellence and the talent availability, it does help both countries because the UK company, they are not cutting people. They are growing still internationally. But in China, they are creating new opportunities for employment and also for new business. So I think at business level, I certainly see a UK-China relationship, if it is positive and become stronger in this year, would help prosperity in general. So talking about the UK government, as you said, because UK economy is not growing and there's a new government, there's an opportunity to start again with China. So what's your top advice?
Oh, well, so the last few years have been quite negative for UK-China relations and done a lot of damage. And I think that just rebuilding the links is what we do at the moment. I mean, just rebuilding the links. So I think that the new government are doing the right thing in just trying to normalize the relationship. We need to wait for a little bit of time. because we don't know what America's going to do. Trump has an idea about China, I think, which is that there's a big new deal, that China and America can do this big new deal. And I think that that will involve things like American access to the middle class consumer market in China, some rebalancing of trade. I don't know how that works. 600 billion US dollars of two-way trade a year between China and America, but still 400 billion of that is Chinese exports to America. And a lot of that is high-tech equipment. So it's sort of, hard
And
to
they're
know.
made by the US manufacturers in China, a lot of them, right?
Indeed. Yeah. So I don't know how that rebalance. I have no idea. But if you're going to be mercantilist like Trump, you kind of, I suppose there's got to be some sign that you're selling stuff into America, China. I think the third thing really is about China being contributing more to global public goods. I mean, Trump wants everyone to start paying for their defense, and I'm sure he's not happy about China benefiting from American, sort of naval assets, keeping the global seaways, clear. And I think that he wants China to contribute more to sort of those global public goods. I don't know how that works, because people get very nervous when China becomes more active. So I don't know how that works, but that's what I think he wants. And finally, I think there's sort of just a constant acceptance of America being number one. I think Trump just wants America always to be number one. Again, I don't know how that works. So in the next 6 months, it's going to be a key time because presumably, despite all the domestic issues in America, what Trump is going to do, his administration, is prepare for this big deal, trade deal number two, right? And I guess that Britain's sort of basically got to sit there and see what that means for Britain. Because presumably America can go and open up big new services markets in China, then so can Britain, right? For Britain, the focus needs to remain on two things. One is a greater clarity over where and how Chinese investment works for us in Britain. We did have the Hinkley Point nuclear deal, but that didn't work because we, got worried by it. But there must be other areas where we can think about Chinese investment, and there can be consistency. That's the first thing. I think the second thing is the companies that you're talking to, no doubt, all need this. Some idea of how you get access to the great Chinese middle class. Their consumption levels are low, and they will be key for the Chinese government. It's trying to sort of build that up, but it's always been a problem. As long as you and I have been dealing with this, consumption in China has always been low, and it's got to rise. I noticed the other day that there was a meeting in Beijing. Xi Jinping met with non-state companies, private companies, Ren Zhengfei of Huawei, and, people for other companies. Jack Ma Yun has apparently made a comeback. I guess that shows that we now have a sense the Chinese government realizes the private sector is really critical as an innovator, an investor, and employer of people, right? And so I suppose for Britain, it always seemed to me important, how do we kind of work out where we work with these companies and how they are our allies in trying to get access to this Chinese middle class, particularly for services, which is where Britain is strong. I think that's been a long problem, but I think now we need to really, really create a strategy between government and business in Britain to try and crack this one, because I think that actually the opportunity is probably okay now. A lot of countries might not be doing this because they're cautious, they're hesitant. Within the EU, obviously, there's a lot of kind of, cautiousness. But I think for Britain, now we're out of the EU, maybe the one thing we can do is have a bit more kind of adventurousness with our policies in trade. And I think China is obviously potentially a big target. I think if you just had those sort of two or three things, that would mean a policy. You'd have to be consistent. We can't keep chopping and changing. But I suspect in the next few months that, in fact, our relationship with China will become even more straightforward, because I think America is just going to be more and more worrying for people. And I sort of think that China will probably look, I don't know, at least we can predict what China's going to do. I mean, crazy world, huh? But I mean, we know what China's going to be like. It's not like it's going to change. That's fine.
Yes, and of course, UK always sees US market as free market and open market, and
Yeah.
now US is going to put tariffs on UK products as well. So,
Yeah.
China is the second biggest market, but for some of the sectors is the biggest market.
Mm.
So for UK companies, as you said, particular service providers, it's really worthwhile to do more this year, considering the political environment is improving.
Yeah.
And so for the Chinese investment into UK has dropped in the last few years, and I
Yeah.
have seen what's happening. I have a very well-known Chinese tech companies we're talking to, and they're really keen to invest into the Cambridge high-tech ecosystem, but they are being shut out just because they are seen as, one of the Chinese companies with Chinese government background. In fact, it's not the case. So once the UK government has more clarity and in fact, there's policy coming out to encourage this or to make it clear that certain division, of sectors or subsectors, because the British National Security and Investment Bill is still too vague in certain areas. It's covered too many areas. So once this improves, we can see there's more Chinese investment coming to the UK. So that's something we really hope in a new Labour government would improve. So for the Chinese government, as you know, it takes two to tango. And what would be your advice for them when it comes to improve the UK-China relations for the two countries' prosperity?
Oh, yeah. Look, I mean, I think that they just have to look after people when they go to China. I mean, it's good that people don't have problems, and in the recent past, there's been issues sometimes with people going and feeling uncomfortable and a bit harassed. I mean, not many, but those sort of things, it's better not to have them. I think the Chinese government, its messaging has always been a problem. I think in the golden age, as you remember, there was a big attempt to promote its message more. But I suppose that for me, kind of the main thing is for it to, I mean, I think that it's it is frustrating dealing with Britain sometimes when we are sometimes, kind of talking about Hong Kong and things like that and getting very, 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 very frustrated. I think, though, that the Chinese government, just has to accept that's part of our domestic politics. It is so much more. I mean, the problem today is that China is so much bigger than the British economy. So it's been a big shift in kind of power. So it's a very weird sort of situation. In some ways, I don't think that China needs to do anything massively different with its policy towards Britain, because in a weird way, we don't really matter to it that much.
That's what I was trying to say, yes.
Yeah, and so it's kind of, I don't know, this is going to sound really weird, but it's just good that China gives us as much attention as it does give us, right? because it's got massive markets in Latin America, in Africa, the Middle East. I mean, it's massive still with Europe. It's massive still with China, America. I mean, we are a tiny proportion of its trade.
Yeah.
And I think that's really hard to deal with a country where you've got a big historic relationship. But to be honest, the power is now almost all in China's hands. And I think it's very strange for it to hear Chinese, British politicians acting like we still are this big, big player, because I think for China, we're not. I mean, we're a significant, we're on the P5, we're still significant. I'm not belittling that, but we're not a big, big player. So I think for the Chinese government, in many ways, the frustration is that they're dealing with a country which is significant, but acts like it's still really, really number one. And so I think it's frustrating. I guess I don't think there's much. I mean, surely China wants its middle class to spend more. It is important, therefore, that it does allow more access, like the Common Agreement on Investment. It's signed with the EU at the end of 2019. It wasn't ratified, but I think if Britain is able to do something like that, it would be very helpful, because I think the Chinese government just needs to give outsiders more idea of what would work in terms of getting access to the middle class and the consumption market in China, because it's still tough. And there still needs to be more clarity. But on the whole, I mean, the legal system in China commercially is now more predictable. That's good. On the whole, officials tend to be more predictable. They're not as corrupt as they were in the past. That's good. I think it's more straightforward, but it's still a very competitive and tough environment, as you well know. So we need people like you to tell us how we can do this. Not easy, but I think that's the only thing that I would say China could help making more clarity about that pathway.
I totally agree with you. I think in China, the last few years, particularly last 2 years, has made it more difficult for foreign companies, when it comes to regulations on compliance and data and things like that. And so the governments now recognize they are turning. So just recent weeks, it's in a few days, the Minister of Chinese Commerce has issued new policy about how to stabilize foreign direct investment in China, encourage them to even foreign companies can now get loans in China from Chinese banks, as well as allow them to invest into other Chinese companies and things like that, and also give them financial incentives if they they put more investment after they're already been operating in China. So I can see that China is doing more. Of course, this is not just specifically to UK, but I think it's good news for the UK company as well. So on your point, I just want to also agree with you. Yes, I think China sees UK as one of the partners, but not the most important partners. Particularly after Brexit, the UK's position as a springboard to Europe is no longer there. To put things into perspective, we need China. More than China needs the UK. UK needs China more for its prosperity, for its. So, thank you very much, Kerry. I think we can chat for another few hours.
It's a great pleasure, and thank you very much for doing this and for all your work in trying to help create greater British-Chinese kind of cooperation. So thank you, and great to speak to you.
Yeah, let's both do more this year and help the UK-China relations in our own ways.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Talking China Business. If you like this podcast, subscribe, like, and share. We discuss all aspects of driving business growth in China. Your comments, suggestions, and questions are always welcome. Do get in touch. Our website is www.crayfish.io, and our email address is hello@crayfish.io. You can find us on LinkedIn, YouTube, and X. It's crayfish.io.